All right. Uh, I assume this means I can be heard now. Welcome to the Advanced Case Gen workshop by me. Uh, I am not the person who is controlling the clicking, so every time we have to go to a slide, I will say, next slide, please, Parth, just for the recording. So, next slide, please, Parth. What we're going to cover in this workshop is just general things to go over in terms of prep time and the application of those ideas within case generation. The disclaimer going forward is that these are my ideas. They just came to me, as ideas tend to do. So if you disagree with certain things, or if you have questions to raise during the workshop, don't feel afraid to just stop me or pause me. I'll probably have moments during the workshop where I'll also pause to see if there's anything that's been confusing or not been explained properly. Next slide, please. So I think there are different types of idea generation within the debate. I think there's three specific ones. The first is, I think, a sort of subconscious case generation. And these are case generations which I think can only be externally applied. That is to say, facts that you know about the world, stories from your own personal experience, specific knowledge or key statistics. And I think, importantly, cases that have already been ran before, or the idea of those said cases. This is a sort of case generation that you can't really ever do in 15 minutes. Like, you can't learn more about the world. So these are things that you can only really do outside of debate. In terms of inside debate, these are the conscious things that you'll be thinking about, or deductive case generation, and things that we start labeling with like the debate jargon, right? Of framing, which is the sort of angle that you end up taking in the debate, mechanization, impacting, weighing, and to an extent rebuttal, because all rebuttal is just framing, meching, impacting, and weighing, just in the negative. And then there's strategic case positioning, which is the sort of case generation that is only really applicable to British parliamentary debate, which involves positioning or knowing which arguments to run, or what sort of specific rebuttal or ideas to be able to pick. This workshop's going to focus on the first two types. The reason for this is that I think strategic case generation, or the way in which to work around the BP style of game, is one, not something I'm very good at, but also something which I think is a very different skill, and one that is reliant upon external case generation or deductive case generation. And the point of me telling you this is to just emphasize how important I think case generation is in terms of doing well in debate. You can know how to strategically position, or you can know how to work around the game of BP debate, but at the end of the day, I do just think debate is just a game of ideas, and without having a solid grasp on those key fundamentals of how to generate good ideas, I think you're certainly limited, at least in the ceiling of how high you're able to hit within the speeches or within the round. So I think we're going to first start off with external case generation and the better ways to be able to learn about those things and have them come up to you within rounds. And the next thing we're going to work on is internal case generation. Next slide, please. So the all case gen is the application of external knowledge or information, and the process of turning that information into content that can be applied to one round. And most debates, at the end of the day, are made to be quite accessible and aren't meant to be something that you need to know huge swathed amount to be able to win the round. I mean, it's why we have things like the AIV, and that the judge should be judging from the perspective of someone who just like reads the news. Obviously, if you don't know anything about an idea, it's going to be pretty difficult, and we'll cover that later in the workshop. But I do just think when most people interact with debate topics or ideas, they have all the necessary prerequisite information to win a round. But in the instances in which you don't, I think it is very, very important to just be actively aware of that and try and think about what it is that you know and how to be able to generate content from that. So the ways in which you can do that is to firstly just actively think about how information can be applied for debate. This does seem a little cringe, but like a lot of debates that you end up doing are just questions about how people end up interacting with one another. So ultimately, they're just like questions about human psychology, especially when you think about stuff like narratives debates or social movements debates, or honestly, even economics or politics debates. I guess I've just described nearly every type of debate. But ultimately, what you're really debating there is how people are going to be acting or moving or reacting to things. And I think when you're able to start having an active appreciation that people work as a result, or do actions due to specific specific rationalized reasons or context, you are then able to start thinking about patterns of behavior and how you're then able to apply this. Specifically, I think you're then better able to understand how like humans are able to work, which I do think is like a very important aspect of how case generation or in fact any ideas or arguments are ending up in the first place. Ideas are two things. The first is the thing I just mentioned of internal aspects or ideas or ways in which humans patterns are working. The second thing is normative, that is to say whether or not this thing is good or bad. This is also important because when you're thinking about these things, it's quite important to think about whether it is a normatively good or bad thing. And I think this is where just thinking about the intuitions or ideas that you actually hold can be just a very useful avenue for case gen. That is to say, if you believe a certain thing, really reflect on why it is that you believe that specific thing. Why don't you believe an external thing? And if you don't believe an external thing, why is it that someone else holds that opinion, but you don't end up doing? And it's these sorts of questions which then begin to elucidate aspects of why we hold certain beliefs or ideas that could then be very useful to start actually applying to debate rounds when these things start actually coming up. In terms of like, cringe introspection ideas, you could also just like consume a lot of stuff. I think reading is kind of some of the best advice you can get for debate. It doesn't work for everyone, but I do think just anything that gets you engaged is something that can end up being used for debate later down the line. So anything you can use to get yourself engaged is quite important. Whether that be you're watching a video essay, whether that be you're watching a podcast or a movie, things that are related to the topic or idea tend to have insulary themes that you can draw upon. And if you are just consuming media, that media itself can be something that can be drawn upon. That is to say, why is it that things are represented this way? Say you're watching a war movie. There are probably things that you could pick up from that about war itself, right? About like perhaps logistics of war. But then there's other things about the representation that is being shown to you. Why is it being represented in that way? What is it about the characters that are being shown in that way? Is this a positive or a negative? There are a lot of things that just end up like breaking apart or taking down within just things in life that I think can be used a lot in debate. I would say specific theorists are quite useful. This are like Marxist theorists because they're always quite obsessed with breaking down like ideologies and why we interact with stuff. Maybe they're a bit of difficult read sometimes, but I think they can be fun. I think the other things you can also use is just refine upon arguments that you yourself have ran or watched and the ways in which you could have changed things later down the line. And I think one of the worst things that people can do is when they've like done badly in a debate or done badly in an argument is to just like be like, the round's lost, the round's gone. Debates are quite reoccurring and often focus on the same themes or ideas. When you're able to think about what you could have done to win the round, you're kind of working your neural activities to be able to think of those things later down the line or have those tools to use. And the final thing in terms of consuming is to just don't feel afraid to ask someone who you think knows more about a topic than you, both in terms of debaters, because I think debaters who are more experienced or debaters who are specialized in a specific topic are quite useful to ask, such as Alishba, who's doing the religion workshop right now, or Alex Zusic, who's doing the econ workshop. Those people know quite a lot about the topic, they're quite informed, and are usually quite open. But I also think non-debaters, like my flatmate, is really, really interested in international politics, and I have just spent quite a large amount of time just talking to him about these things. And you do get to learn a perspective on the world, which from debaters' lens can just be used to build arguments with, but in terms of non-debaters' lens is like actual perspectives about the world, which, like I've said before, can be used to break apart and be used as tools in terms of generating ideas. Does anyone have any questions about the read more books slide? Cool. Next slide, please, Parth. In terms of how to actively do it, there are different ways that debaters do it. I personally find best to think about what I have just learned and how it could be applied towards the debate. I find that's the best way for me to stick towards specific ideas. Some people do it very differently. A great example of this is Ryan Lafferty's WDC 2024 and 2025 matter files. We could find on forums, but I'll probably link in the description of this YouTube video when it comes out. But that matter file, while it is extensive and quite a lot and not something which I think everyone wants to commit to, it is a fantastic example of someone going out of their way to learn stuff that they previously didn't know, but also figure out how to apply that within debate. And I feel like once you have the active learning of turning information that you have in your life and turning those into debate round concepts is when you're starting to be able to weaponize all aspects of the subconscious facts that you know about the world, and then turning them into deductive processes and reasonings that you're then actually able to convince a judge about in very simplistic ways. So that's how I think you'd be actively learning in terms of this case generation. Next slide, please. The remainder of this workshop is going to focus on the deductive aspect. And a very smart man told me once, Jamie Beverstock, that prep time is the most important time within debate because it is where you get the most ideas out. In terms of what you should be doing in prep time, I think the most important thing is to be able to ask the right questions. Both you and your partner are both people who hold large amounts of information and understanding about the world. You've been living in it for a large period of time. The question is, what is the sort of ways you're able to get the best information out of your partner? And I think sometimes the best debaters are those who just have the best skills in prep time, even if they don't necessarily have the greatest execution or strategy, just because they're able to exploit the most out of their partner and make their partner better while also making themselves better. So in terms of asking the right questions, firstly, just break down the motion. It clarifies the burden, but also the uniqueness of each motion. Specifically, think about the wordings that are used in the motion, why the wordings are used in that way, and what you're actually debating about. Semantic bullshittery doesn't always lead to great outcomes, but I think a large amount of times it can, specifically in motions that refer to rise or refer to prominence. These are specific vocabulary that is being used by the CAs. Trying to figure out what the CAs are trying to get there can be very, very useful. Also, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your partnership can really relay quite a lot about what you're able to use within your prep time. Sometimes this obviously isn't applicable, especially if you just like started your partnership with someone or you're being partnered for a comp that you don't really know them. But for long-term partnerships, knowing the strengths and weaknesses of what someone is good or bad at can be very, very useful. The other thing, the reason why it can be quite useful can also be not immediately on the surface level. That is to say, sometimes there are instances where it's like an econ motion or a philosophy motion, and you know your partner is really, really good at those things, but maybe they're not having the best ideas. Being able to prod them in the right ways allows you to be able to weaponize the best aspects of their strength. It's not just that they can tell you everything, it's that when they tell you something and you have an immediate response to that idea they just come up with, they will then have a better preemption to the rebuttal that you're able to provide, right? So it's not just necessarily that the person will be able to feed you everything, but it's that their dynamic in prep changes into what ideas and who should be asking the sorts of questions. The other thing is also just think through the basics. What are the burdens that need to be matched? Check each other's burdens. What are the simple headline claims for the cases you want to run? What's the opposition side? What is exclusive and non-exclusive? Things that you've basically been taught since day one. But 15 minutes is really not that much time at the end of the day. And I think once you've been doing the BP debate for a while, you kind of forget that it really is only 15 minutes. And so doing just the very, very basics is often quite forgotten about, or very easy to be forgotten about, even in the very highest level of rounds. So just knowing that you're just getting these simple questions out, knowing that your partner is on the same page as you, means you're able to answer these basic questions and have those specific contents and the benefits that you can come out of that. Next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of the basics, I think the three most like important basics is why is X thing good, why is Y thing bad, and in terms of what X or Y is, you can honestly just look at the motion. The motion itself already is giving you some cases within it. That is to say, when you're saying this house believes that someone should do X policy over Y policy, the immediate case generation is why is X thing good, why is Y thing bad. Like the debate itself can often throw you bones in terms of what ideas you should be prepping. In terms of other basics, it's just why will X happen? Why won't Y happen? That is a specifically more important basic, especially when you're regarding burdens, because I think specifically once you understand why an idea is good or bad, you forget the logic chains that need to be met for ideas to be happening. So one specific example that I think is quite useful, and one that I saw happening to a program sometimes, was that there would be instances of the teams running when a law would be overturned, so the action that law was precluding would be happening more. And what you and to some extent it's true, right? Like if you stop a law that says now smoking weed is legal, for example, more people will be smoking weed. But it doesn't really get to the root of the issue. That is to say, there are still certain underlying burdens that in some debates do have to be met, of why is it that someone is doing that action, and why is the law being overturned actually the tipping point for perhaps doing more or less of that action in the first place, and in what circumstances would that action be happening. So it's those sorts of like granular questions which I think become significantly more important. In terms of the final thing, and I think this is like a really excellent like tip which I learned like a year ago, is just the simple question of what does this look like. And again, I think this is quite important within prep time, where like you're coming up with ideas, you're saying stuff in the abstract, you're saying how people will interact with the abstract, but if you cannot actually think of a way in which this pattern of behavior will be working, if you cannot tell me a like believable anecdote, if you cannot come up with a realistic story, then it will just be very, very hard to believe, and in its worst cases will just actually be actively false. The more and more you illustrate, the better your reasoning will be, because you're actually trying to come up with realistic conceptions rather than abstract conceptions. But it'll just be that the judge is likely to buy your claims better too, because you're painting a story to them. While BP debate does center in analysis, the centering for analysis to be bought does rely upon intuition. So if you're able to just focus better stories, that necessarily works better. I think you can also like get really rhetorical with this as well. This looks like in relationship motions, drawing upon your own previous experiences, or in friendship motions, maybe having a nice anecdote about like friends you weren't friends with now, but now you're friends with them. Like these sorts of stories make the debate feel a lot more realistic and really engage you to be interacting with the real world, something that I think is often forgotten about, or can be forgotten about in certain rooms. Next slide, please. So here's an example we have of a motion we did yesterday, and if you have, and this is a motion that was set at SSDC Pro-Am. What I've highlighted in this motion are specific aspects of the motion that I think can be drawn upon in order to generate cases from, even if you don't really have an understanding of teleology, virtue ethics, or utilitarianism. And the way in which I've broken this down is by looking at aspects of the wording that are specifically quite interesting, right? So, for example, the things in blue are things that seem like they're giving you information, but themselves are quite vague. Like, what does maximizing desirable outcomes mean? What does it mean to prioritize in comparison to maximizing? What does it mean to use a moral framework? What does it mean to decide? What does it mean to use a different ideologies? And these are sorts of questions which then elucidate certain aspects of the debate in quite more tangible aspects. So, for example, honing on one thing of it is in terms of deciding healthcare and social policies, the term deciding is quite interesting, right? Because it implies that there is a body who is making these specific decisions. And the sort of examples that are given to you in the motion, such as priority list, budget allocation, care plans, these don't seem to be ideas that are made by vast swathes of populaces, right? It doesn't seem to be that says we're going to vote on a specific policy and this is what the population wants. It seems to be a lot more civil service orientated, company orientated, individual actors who have the greatest ability to coordinate these things, not in terms of the wide scale policies that are happening, but almost in terms of the logistics of how these things are being carried about, which then just, I think, allows you to just get a better frame of the motion or where this thing is going to be taking place. Another example that you can use in terms of using the motion in terms of generating case ideas is even just in the motion itself of teleology versus deontology. Why is it that teleology has both utilitarianism and virtue ethics? What is the benefit of having two moral systems in one? Is there specific negatives of having two moral systems in one? It's these sorts of ideas that can, I think, be great points to start generating arguments from. I'll have an example later where we actually where I show you how to like generate arguments from these sorts of basic ideas. But this is just an example of how just a motion itself, I guess motions are the only thing that you draw ideas from, but I guess how a motion itself can be a great jumping point for future ideas and better questions to be able to asking yourself. It turns the abstract into, okay, this is civil services making decisions. What does that actually end up meaning for the actors or incentives involved? And you can really start honing down the specifics of emotion. Next slide, please. In terms of a few more checklist of questions to ask, I've already said what does meaningfully look like in the real world. Honestly, that might just be coming up quite a few times during this workshop. I do legitimately believe this is probably the most important question to be continuously asking yourself. Don't get lost in the sauce. In terms of framing and what I mean by being honest is that being honest doesn't necessarily mean you have to use the really a charitable framing every single time. But what it does mean is that you're best able to understand what the debate is actually taking place in. And I think there is just a benefit both in opening and closing to just being as honest as possible. Sometimes the strategic advantage is to not, of course, but it does mean that you're most insulated against the best versions of opposition claims to a far better degree. And it also means that you are working with less that then forces you to work with more. So the idea of that thinking is that when you're faced with a debate, it's often very hard to know where you're going to be focusing in on. But when you're able to just split it down to a specific thing that is occurring or specific guidelines that you yourself have to follow, it then means that your case gen is going to be far more realistic. I've already mentioned the negatives of not letting your partner dictate to you entirely, but I can't emphasize how like important this thing is. Having your partner dictate to you entirely just means you're having one person's ideas, and you're just not benefiting off what two people can meaningfully contribute towards a discussion. I won't repeat what I've just mentioned earlier, though. In terms of mechanizing and what you can do for actors, mechanizing can also be a fantastic way to find more arguments in the mechanisms themselves, especially when you're in closing and your opening takes a lot of your mechanisms and you're left with like two. Expanding out those mechanisms can themselves be a fantastic like argument jumping off point. So a way in which you could do this is just think about the sub impacts that can be claimed as a result of the mechanism being done, and then you can usually find a lot more avenues to scope out the motion. All mechanisms is just a recursive list of why things happen, and all debate is just here's why things happen and here's why things are good. So when you're really like in the zone of a mechanism and you start thinking about the underlying implications of the mech or what external impacts can be claimed and what those impacts end up leading, then it means that you're able to just have an entire argument or benefits located in the mechanism of your argument, even in the end impact of your argument. And it means that already your case is like getting a lot more full, getting a lot harder to respond to, and meaning that even if the final burden of your case is entirely taken out, the first three burdens have proven benefits and impacts all by themselves, which you can already attribute to the motion. I think that's pretty huge. Finally, in terms of actors, I've sort of already given an example of this with the teleology and like the people who will be making this decision stuff. But actors can also be quite huge because at the end of the day, all debate is just like actors doing stuff. And who does this involve and what comprises and makes up those actors? The question of what comprises and makes up those actors, I think, can be especially important because I think it's easy to think about people as people when the question is about individuals, right? When the question asks about politicians, when the question asks about CEOs or even just like individual people making decisions and actor motions. But in terms of like large scale, corporations, so like how corporations act, how equity firms act, how companies act, how religious organizations act, it becomes a lot more confusing to think about what those incentives actually are and what groups of people end up actually wanting or deciding upon. And thinking of them as groups of people can be quite helpful in a lot of ways of just thinking about what the restrictions or negatives are and what it means their incentives will actually be. That is to say, the incentives of a group in abstract, that is to say the Catholic Church, might be very different from the group of the people who comprise up the Catholic Church, rather than just the platonic ideal of the Catholic Church you'll be appealing to. This is just another way that I think you can make the case generation just a lot more realistic. Next slide, please. I also think thinking about the opposition bench is a very underutilized skill and one that is very beneficial. Thinking about the strongest pushes requires a lot of case generation, but in opposite direction. When you're kind of lost in the source of your own side, you forget to think about how the opposition side would be able to respond to things, or you begin to neglect the very best pushes from opposition. So you think, oh, if I'm going to say this, we'll just say this, but you never really consider the other layers of that, of what can opposition say to respond to this. But when you're able to spend time thinking about what the opposition will be doing, then you're really able to think about the burdens and mechanisms and impacts that they want to prove and claim, and you're able to circumvent those to a far higher degree. But it necessarily means that it's built into your argumentation. So it doesn't necessarily mean you even have to spend more time responding. If your case already holds aspects of their argumentation, then you're able to already beat them in quite a lot of ways. One way that I know partnerships like to do this is that one person thinks about the prop case and the other person thinks about the op case. That is a thing that works. I know other partnerships like to have you think about the prop case together, then you think about the op case together. Realistically, it's a partner by partnership dependent scenario and what works for you guys. But I do think in every single debate, having a significant amount of time thinking about the opposition bench just makes your arguments significantly stronger. Next slide, please. Okay. So here are actual things you could do when you know nothing about a specific motion. And this is what I think is probably the most helpful one out of the ones I'm going to show you forward, or at least the one which I think will have the highest likelihood of success. And this is what I've called ground up case generation, or case generation built upon premises rather than built upon ideas or things that you might know. And so the way in which this works is that in the debate, just identify aspects of whatever it is that you're talking about that you know to be true, and then just draw from them to make normative claims or arguments. So the benefits of this is that you'll always come up with something reasonable because it will be rooted in truth. For example, if there is an incentive that you know is an incentive, and there is a limitation that you know is limited on the debate, then that is something that you could always draw upon, and it will always be something that you could really work with. It also is a restriction, and I think restrictions are quite important within case gen sometimes, because I think you could really get like lost in abstract ideas or really, really large fanciful claims. But I think when you know these are true claims, and by circumventing or coming up with a case that is against these true claims, we're going to lose the debate, then I think it forces like a restriction upon the case gen that's beneficial. The cons is that it can be a little bit limiting creatively, but this should just be a last resort, or when you are really struggling, rather than something you should always be turning to. Next slide, please. Here's a specific example of this. So the motion, this house believes that social networking sites have done more harm than good for interpersonal interaction. And here are a number of true claims that I've generated about the motion above. So one, people have less of a necessity to be in person for social interaction. This is just due to the nature of social networking sites, right? Like in order for us to socially interact, we need we need to interact with each other, and so to be in person or to like write letters is like less useful because we or less needed, at least, because we could just like go online. Interpersonal interaction encompasses a spectrum of interactions. So this is a very simple claim that there are different sorts of interpersonal interactions. You can have stranger between stranger interactions. You can have friend between friend, lover between lover, parent and child. That's just an important aspect, recognizing there are just a lot of different interactions. And finally, social networks are ran by companies. I guess in some cases they're not, if you're talking about like the CCP, but I think it's a fair claim to be like, in the majority of cases, social networks are run by companies. And from generating these like just true claims, things that can kind of been deduced from your understanding of social network, or even just your understanding of what interpersonal interaction is and how wide interpersonal interaction could go, you're able to just generate arguments based off those true claims. So firstly, less in-person interaction is itself bad. There are probably a number of ways you can prove this, maybe like empirically, maybe like the human body needs to see people in physical touch or whatever evolution mechs. You could talk about how you can't be as close to your friends anymore and you're more prone to hostile interaction online. You can talk about the skills related to interpersonal connection and how those things will be able to change. You can talk about how, because social networks are made by companies, the incentive structure of companies is to make interpersonal interaction as engaging as possible, which is, if you're wanting to do this negatively, you could say it's done through promotion of controversy. If you're wanting to do this positively, you could say this is done through things like Reddit and forming communities that everyone can hang out with or share. What we've just done in like basically a few minutes, and this didn't take me very long to come up with, is just the generation from true ideas into argumentation. And this is a pretty easy example, and I think like not the hardest motion in the world, but even in much more difficult motions, I think the same principle of this sort of case generation still applies, of just turning true things that you know about the world into a normative claim that can then itself be good or bad or justified in a number of ways. And it's just a good jumping off point to be able to recognize what you need to end up doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's another way to do it. This is another debate that we covered yesterday at Pro-Am, which was this house believes that Abrahamic religions should adopt the concept of moral offsetting in their preaching. For the recording and for those who don't know what moral offsetting is, this is the idea that when you have done something bad, you need to do a virtuous act in overturning that to like counterbalance your like moral karma. So Abrahamic religion should tell people that they should do good things to counteract the bad stuff, instead of telling people to do it through repentance. In terms of like what government are going to say, I think it's quite clear, and I think most op teams would have been able to recognize it's quite clear that they're just going to say more good things happen. Like charity, kindness is going to happen. It's probably pretty good that when you do a bad thing, you do it and then you do a good thing after that, because then the good thing is good. And the question is, how do we deal with this claim? There are a few potential strategies. You could mitigate it. You could flip it. You could outweigh it. Do you want to go to the next slide? Next slide, please, Parth. Oh, thank you. And the question becomes, what is the best thing to actually do to deal with this claim? So in terms of mitigation, why will not that many good things happen, as Gov says they will? You still need a positive push to be able to win the round. I guess if you're like an excellent debater and you like mitigate everything and prove that nothing changes, then sure, I guess you can win if you weigh on symmetry. But realistically, you need a positive push to the claim. So realistically, that's not the best way of case genning for this round, especially if you don't really know how to beat that claim. The other thing is outweigh. What benefits can outweigh good things happening? Again, that is something which I think if you're a very strong debater and you have a good argument about what you want to run already, that is also something you could potentially go to. The issue is that I think that also requires a level of creativity in terms of getting a positive case that is able to counteract it all and then be outweighed. So the question is, the easiest way to be able to beat this claim is to just flip it, and it's also the clearest one that probably requires the least amount of like internal legwork or self-justification to explain why charity is actually not that important, which is flipping the claim and explaining why less good things would be happening on Gov. Next slide, please. So in terms of flipping how this is going to happen, the questions then end up looking a little bit different, because then you have to really start breaking down, how am I going to flip the claim that good things will happen? And the first way to do this is to just understand what the government line of reasoning is. So what will happen is that, why do people do the good things on Gov? Because they have done a bad thing that they need to offset. There's also another thing that they have to recognize that it's bad, but I guess that's like symmetric for the debate, because on upside to repent, you also have to recognize that it's bad. Then the question then becomes, why do people do bad things? And then I think the reasons that you end up coming about as a result of that are quite useful for opposition. That is to say, people do bad things as a result of recurring habit or me giving into the desires. They do things that sometimes you would say are outside of your control, or things that are separate to you, or just in terms of mistakes. But the interesting thing about people doing bad things that they know are bad is that there is something that is stopping them from being able to access the autonomy of just stopping to doing the bad thing, right? That is to say, if you're in that situation and you could have just not done that bad thing, you would have just not done the bad thing, right? And of course, there are a lot of instances where the bad thing that is being done is necessarily one-off, but the one that is most applicable to the most amount of people is people who do bad things and then just keep doing bad things, either due to a recurring habit outside of their control, accident. And so you can turn an entire case into, when people just offset the bad actions they do, they never actually stop doing the bad actions, because they don't end up feeling the necessary guilt or repentance or fulfillment that you can get on opposition when religions tell you that you should just just be uniquely guiltful and you should be uniquely repentful. You could talk about how the actions of repentance require you in learning about the bad stuff that you've done. The actions of repentance require you spending those nights at the altar, listening of the harms that you have caused, going out of your way to make amends, which in the process of repenting, you end up doing good stuff, which often offsets the moral harm you could argue anyway. Credit to Rhea Abrahams for this case. I learned about this one yesterday. I thought it was pretty good. But I think the benefit of the example of the Rhea Abrahams case as well is that when I learned that she had run that case, you were the question then becomes, how do I come up with that case if I didn't have Rhea in the room with me? I think this is just a very, very gorgeous line of reasoning as to why you aren't able to get the benefits happening on Gov, because you can get the benefits on op, but the main harm is that people just end up keep doing bad things. And then of course you have to weigh this out of like you can weigh this out with intuition pumps and other things, but we don't necessarily have to cover that. The other way you could potentially flip it is, what good things will people actually be doing? And that's another necessary burden that Gov has to prove. And I think you could also just try and flip it by claiming the good things people will be doing will be bad. And you can probably do this in a number of ways, of perhaps the actual religious action of what counts as moral offsetting will be a harmful thing. Perhaps it's going to be repressive to other people. Perhaps it's going to be harmful to yourself. Perhaps it's going to be uniquely punishing in a certain way. Or it could just be that people will not interpret moral offsetting well. So they're going to do the easiest way out, or they're going to be doing something that they think is the most effective way of solving it, but isn't actually. So for example, you do more like effective altruism. Credit to Eli for that case. And the effective altruism is necessarily more bad than doing the average actions that you would have done on your everyday life. So this is just a few ways of understanding the premises of government's case, understanding the ways in which they have to make their argumentation, and then thinking about undercutting those premises inherently when you're coming up with your case to already be beating them on those fronts. And I think in certain motions like these, or specifically in motions that you think are leaning towards one side, or there's an obvious case, the benefit of being on the side that doesn't have the quote-unquote obvious case is that you can really work on the non-obvious case, and you can make it something that is clever and pushing against other burdens and premises. Next slide, please. In terms of what to do when you know nothing about a specific motion, if either of those things don't work, I think you can also draw upon related themes and ideas of the motion. So what are common debates and issues that exist in the real world with the topic that's around the motion, and how do people engage with that idea? I think there's a unique benefit towards thinking about these things in this specific way. So for example, what I mean by this is, you see a law motion and you start thinking about what are the common issues regarding law, or when you see like a religion and so for example, there was a motion that I saw which was, this house would ban faith-based schools at LC Open. If you know nothing about faith-based schools, you can start thinking about how religion starts interacting with children, or even more simple than that, you can start thinking about how the benefits of education, the benefits of religion, and whether those two things should be coinciding with one another. So you can really take a step back and break apart a motion based off the ideas or themes that the motion itself is surrounding. But even aside from that, you can start thinking about opinions that other people just hold on this. So for example, in a law motion, something which I don't think is necessarily ran in BP debate a lot due to like the left bias, but something that I think a lot of people believe in the real world, that is to say, people deserve prison time because they've committed a harm, and that harm should just be something that you spend time in prison for. Like you've committed a harm of your own, out of your own accord. You shouldn't be allowed on the streets talking to regular good-minded people. This is an opinion that I think a large amount of people in the world do hold. Obviously, I think with a little more nuance and specificity than the bluntness I have just parroted it in. But I think it is a unique idea or perspective that even if you yourself do not hold, understanding that people hold that different perspective and then trying to understand why they hold that perspective means that you can often access a level of generation that perhaps is outside the traditional political views that your room will be able to hold. It's also why I think when you're in a room of people where you hold a vastly different political ideology to, it's just sometimes a fantastic benefit. Sometimes it can be a massive hindrance because you're on the back foot. But in other ways, it can be a massive benefit because you can think of new perspectives of seeing the world where other people can't. In terms of what you can also just think about what you've run before or what is commonly run in these ideas. So like relationship motions, most arguments kind of default back into safer relationships or less stigma surrounding those relationships. In econ motions, like most of the arguments are more money, or the money safer or more stable in some way. In religion motions, there's often arguments referring to communities, organized structures, individuals, charity. All these things are things that can basically be applied to most of the debates that you have regarding these issues and ideas. Sometimes they can be red herrings. Sometimes, like in certain religion motions, communities will never actually be that much of a clash. In certain econ motions, more money may actually never be that much of a clash. But in most of these debates, just be benefit of relationships that matters. We're doing a narratives debate. Is there something about the way in which the narrative that is proliferate that matters? Just having an understanding, like once you do enough debates, you'll have an understanding of the common things that will be reoccurring as a result of them, and then you'll be able to just have that as another jumping board in terms of coming up with different ideas when you're struggling. Next slide, please. These are the final thoughts about like what to do if you know nothing, and I think these are the final things you should do if the other steps have completely failed. The first is to just identify the things you're stuck on and just why you can't communicate further. Is there a certain mental block? Is there something you do not know? Why is it that you do not know? Sometimes this leads into the don't feel afraid to lie line. That is to say, if there's something that you don't know and it's like a specific speculative claim, then there's a chance that other people in the room may not know it. Sometimes it can be something that you don't know just because you don't know enough about the real world, and in that case, there's not really much you can do aside from just learning from it further. Like if it's a motion about like a sports and you don't know something about football, you don't know the teams there, like I'm sorry to break it to you, but like maybe you should learn a little bit more about sports. There's nothing wrong with that. I think the intellectual humility in the activity is quite useful. I think if anything, it is just one of the benefits of the activity of being able. But also introspecting as to why you couldn't case gen further or what that specific block was also means you're better able to be in a position where you're stuck, to know what questions to be able to be asking later, to at least get something out. And honestly, worst happens, just run whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. At least you'll get better, and at the very least you'll give something a go. I think running something with gusto and actually giving it your all, even if you don't have any clue what's going on, is always, and I do believe this, like always better than running something than running something a little shakily, or running something that you're not super confident on, or and telling the judges I'm not super confident on this. As much as we don't like to admit it, the portrayal of confidence is something that can be very persuasive in terms of changing people's intuitions. But the attempt of running something can also just tell you a lot about the idea, tell you a lot about the intuition, and honestly, it could just tell you a lot about it could just give you stuff that you need to do to get better. The best case that could plausibly happen is that your member runs a case, it's a little bit whack, and MO points out everything that's wrong with it, and then you and Government Whip can just stand up and like save it because they've told you everything that's wrong with it. But then next time you're able to have those preemptions or savings in your member. Like the number of rounds you do, I think you just end up making it make your case gen better and better. But I think just being creative in that regard, and when you're being put in that position to just really go all out, I think is the best advice that can be given. But also just don't feel afraid to lie. Like, what would you like to be true? Just go for it. Maybe you'll get called out for lying. Maybe you won't. It's a 50-50 shot. I think it is better practice to try and do things that you know to be true, to try to win and learn what you could have done better than immediately lying. But at the end of the day, like, something's better than nothing. So just try and generate something. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, that's all I have for the workshop. The final few things that I have on these slides are 3 motion preps. I have done I spent 15 minutes by myself writing very quickly what these motion preps were, of the ideas and cases that you would have. They'll be attached to the link of the description of this video. Anyone who's in the call right now, I'll probably just put it in the pro-am chat if you want them. But the activity that would be fun to do, I think quite useful, is to look at the case and just come up with anything that you could add to make the motion stronger. That is to say, if we were prepping together and this is everything that I had, is there anything that you could add. This activity is best with a partner. The benefit of this activity is to show you that even if you don't have like new content to add, if you have a question to be asked that wasn't answered in that prep document, if you have a new perspective that perhaps wasn't explored in that prep document, that is themselves things that could really be turned into fully fledged out cases yourself. And if you're doing this with a partner, I think even if you're initially quite confused and initially quite stuck, just give it some time, and I think you'll be surprised by the end of the session that you devote to this of how much content you'll actually be able to squeeze out of emotion. Like make it long form, make it enjoyable, and see how much you're actually able to get out of it. uh I think that is the entire workshop. So does anyone have any specific questions in relation to case generation? All right. Hope that was chill, Parth. Uh, Enjoy the rest of the workshops. I think